Good evening, everybody. I am Erin May Quade. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the senior advisor at Gender Justice, and we are going to talk about Little v. Hecox and West Virginia v. B.P.J. tonight. I have two incredible people with me. First, one of my newest colleagues, but fave already. Greta, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hello. Thank you for being here tonight. I am Greta Wiessner, and I am a senior staff attorney at Gender Justice, where I work on our impact litigation and strategic litigation. And Erin is also one of my favorite coworkers.
Don't tell everybody else. No, we'll just tell it to Jess tomorrow in the office.
I will
And
rank
then
them at the end if we have time.
and we'll send it out via email. Joining us is a longtime friend of Gender Justice and now a Gender Justice board member and Olympian, Chris Mosier. Please introduce yourself.
Team USA athlete, we got to say that. Hi, everybody. Chris Mosier, he, him pronouns. I'm a white person with short brown hair and an incredible brown curly mustache. I'm standing in front of a wall of bicycle tires and a sign that says "Let Kids Play" with a trans flag on it. And as you said, joining you from Chicago and excited to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for being here. This is just a wealth of knowledge. And it's going to be so important to have both the legal acumen in Greta and the experience and wealth of knowledge of Chris tonight as we kind of break down the Supreme Court decision. So yesterday, the Supreme Court released their opinions in Little v. Hecox and West Virginia v. B.P.J. I don't think I knew that B.P.J. was short for Becky Pepper Jackson, which is like the cutest name I've ever heard in my entire life. I just need to put that out there. And we're going to just talk about what the Supreme Court did. They upheld state laws that bar transgender girls from participating in girls' school sports. And so we're going to talk about the background of these cases, what the opinion from the court did, and what that means for kids in Minnesota and North Dakota, and where we go next. So let's start with some background, some top lines of the case. And Greta and Chris, because Chris, you've been incredibly involved in both the work to have teams be inclusive, but also the work in community to make sure that we're fighting these legal fights. But I'm going to come to you first, Greta. What are the top lines of these cases? What was the question the Supreme Court was answering, and how did they arrive at needing to answer this question?
Sure. So it was a two-part question. The Supreme Court was answering challenges to state laws that prohibit transgender women and girls from competing on women and girls sports teams. So in essence, competing on teams that are consistent with their gender identity. The laws at issue were the Idaho and West Virginia law, and the plaintiffs were arguing that it would be a violation of both Title IX and the Equal Protection Clause of the federal Constitution to apply those laws to one was a high school age transgender girl, and one plaintiff was a college athlete. And 27 other states do have similar bans. And the top line is that the Supreme Court upheld laws that prohibit trans women and girls from participating on women's and girls' sports teams. The court found it would not violate Title IX, which is the federal statute that prohibits discrimination based on sex or on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program, which would include sports teams. The court also held that it would not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the federal Constitution for states to discriminate against trans women and girls in the context of school sports. And we'll go into some of the details of those decisions later, but a really important top line is that the court expressly disclaimed that this ruling would apply to states that have inclusive policies. In other words, they were only ruling on whether Title IX would allow schools to discriminate and not whether Title IX would require schools to discriminate or states to discriminate. So that means that for now, there is not a conflict between Minnesota's policy, which is inclusive to trans athletes, and Title IX. Unfortunately, this does mean for North Dakota that their ban currently stands and remains in effect. And you'll also notice that I'm referring specifically to trans women and girls. The court specifically said one of the first things in a footnote is, in addition, nothing in this opinion should be interpreted to address or limit participation by, and I'll put quotes around this, biological females on male or co-ed sports teams. So essentially, this ruling does not apply to trans boys and men and their ability to participate consistent with their gender identity. And just a note on language, you'll notice that I use some air quotes. The opinion essentially consistently refers to trans people based on their sex assigned at birth. So Justice Kavanaugh refers to trans women and girls as biological males or biological boys. So if you hear me using that terminology, I do understand and agree that it is offensive, and for the most part, I'll use sex assigned at birth to refer to that. But, it does stand out in the opinion that there's a complete erasure of the trans identity by referring to people based on biological sex. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit about what's really at stake here and who these plaintiffs are, which again, the court seems to totally ignore and erase.
Yeah, Chris, I want to come
Yeah.
to you because, like Greta said, like throughout the decision, I mean, it was just infused with really gross and offensive language. They did some stuff to one of the plaintiffs in order to arrive at this decision, even though she didn't want to be part of the case anymore. Talk to us about who these plaintiffs were, the high school student and the college student. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so the first plaintiff, B.P.J, as she is known, is Becky Pepper Jackson, and she's a 15-year-old plaintiff in West Virginia. She was a middle school student when this case started. So she comes from a family of runners, and she loves track and field. And in 2021, the West Virginia legislature passed HB 3293, which categorically banned trans girls from participating on girls' school sports teams all the way from middle school to college level, which then meant that Becky's eligibility was at question. It also, an important note here is that it bans all levels of competition, even intramural and non-competitive sports. And
Mm.
we'll come back to that later. That's an important footnote on this. So in June 2021, she brought an as-applied challenge to HB 3293. And we just talked about that. And she moved forward and was granted that preliminary injunction. She is an incredible kid. It's really interesting. I just was looking at some photos of her when she started this case. She was truly a child. I mean, we're talking 10 years old. As a 15-year-old now, she is a bright, bubbly young girl. Just so fun, so full of joy, even thrust into the spotlight. And I think that's what really struck me about spending time with her. And I spent time with her and her mother in Washington, D.C. not long ago. And she just has the best attitude. She is. I sort of feel like I'm passing a torch to her when I chat with her because she is just so driven to not only try to fight for her rights, but to try to make it better for other kids like her. So Becky is an accidental activist who just wanted to play, to play with her friends, to do discus and shot put. And she was currently competing in what will now be her last season as a high school athlete because of this decision, which is heartbreaking. In the other case, in Little versus Hecox, there is the college student, Lindsay Hecox, who is now 25 years old. But at the time of this case, she was a young college student athlete or potential athlete who wanted to try out for her women's cross country team at Boise State University. And she actually didn't make the team, but then she went on to challenge on the basis of playing club sports at Boise State. And that's, again, an important note to show the extent of this ruling that it's not just interscholastic school to school competition, but it really extends in this case to club and intramural sports as well. And she, as you mentioned, tried to remove herself from this case. Becky is the outgoing one. Lindsay, in spending time with her, is really reserved and shy until you get to know her, right? And so it did not surprise me that she wanted to exit this case. By the time this was wrapping up, she really just wanted to move on with her life because you can only imagine the amount of hate and criticism and scrutiny she was getting. And we know that it's difficult enough to be a young person right now without that level of attention. But with it, she wanted to just finish her academic career and move on.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know, and you brought up that Lindsay was, wanted to do club sports, but it's also really important to note that the Idaho legislature passed the bill banning trans girls and women from sports right as the pandemic started. This was the bill that they passed like March, like 8th, ninth, 10th of 2020. Like when we were going into the
31st.
30, yes. Oh, we were already
Yeah,
closed
it was
down.
our
And I
trans day of visibility.
Oh, well, there it is. I remember
Yeah.
thinking, this is what they're doing right now, right? Like our legislature was like remote and masked and trying to figure out how to like get people supplies. And they were like, we got to ban trans girls from sports. Like that's how rabid they were to discriminate against this one girl in Idaho. And so I just want to context set that because I remember at the time being like, what are we doing? Um, and so, okay, so we have these two amazing girls. They just want to like play with their friends, do club sports, be 10. And the Supreme Court kind of came in and they were like, no, discrimination is the way to go. And so we have them upholding these state laws, currently saying that states with inclusive laws don't have to discriminate. But what is the outcome now, Greta? What happens in these 27 states? What happens across the country? Like tell us what happens.
So, as of now, the bans that are in place in 27 states remain in effect. And to the extent other states were waiting on a ruling from the Supreme Court in order to pass a ban or make their bans more restrictive, those might pass constitutional muster. But policies that are in place in places like Minnesota that expressly provide for trans inclusion also remain in place. There would also still be room for a challenge that trans men or boys might bring to the extent there are bans that include both trans boys and girls. Although I'm not as familiar with all 27 state policies, they do tend to specifically target trans women and girls. This is not a nationwide ban on trans women and girls participating in sports. And that is important to note. That's, of course, not to undermine just how serious the negative effects and consequences of this opinion are. But if you are in a state that provides for inclusion or has not passed a ban, don't pre-comply and select out. Make sure you know your rights and continue participating if you are able and want to. In terms of
Can I pause you right
just
there really quick,
yes.
Greta? Because I do want to, I think I have it later in that line, but Chris, I want to pull you in to just repeat something you said so beautifully on Threads yesterday, which what Greta just said, but I want to repeat it again about what is and is not as of today based on yesterday's decision. Can I have you repeat that? Oh, you're muted. Yep, there you
So many years later.
go.
So yeah, I believe it was the piece about, ultimately the policy landscape is the same today as it was 2 days ago and as it was, 5 years ago, given the bans that have been passed, right? It did not create a change that is impactful for folks who were not already banned.
Thank you for bringing that up because I really think that a lot of people yesterday might feel like, I mean, obviously the animus towards trans people is very, very real, right? And that came through in the decision, and that's what it feels like. And what was yesterday and the day before that is today in terms of the reality on the ground, in terms of participation. And I think that's really important to hammer home. And Greta, I will come back to you because you were going to go into the rest of the decision, but I just want to make sure we say as many times that nothing will change in Minnesota or in North Dakota. It's just we have more animus now in a Supreme Court opinion that has come out.
And so, just to go into a little more detail on the opinions and what the court said, the opinion was authored by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who is known in many circles as Coach Kavanaugh. This is notable. He, has a well-known interest in sports, supposedly. He's decided a previous case that involved a coach preying on the field. And he famously loves to talk about how he's the father of daughters and that he has coached his daughter's sports team. He actually had his wife and daughters in attendance for this opinion coming down in the court. And Erin, did you just see your own brain? You rolled your eyes so hard?
I think I did actually. It's actually quite tidy up there. I'm
You,
surprised.
you essentially had an MRI via rolling your eyes. And so how the decision broke down, though, um, to me, sad. But the Title IX question was actually 9-0. Some of the
Yeah.
reasoning behind it was different, but it was unanimous that Title IX would allow states to segregate men's and women's sports teams based on biological sex. On the constitutional question, the equal protection question, that was 6-3 on ideological lines, meaning Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ketanji Brown Jackson all dissented with respect to the constitutional question, and Justice Sotomayor wrote a dissent for those justices. Notably, you'll hear that, while obviously Justice Coney Barrett was in the majority, there were three dissenting women judges in an opinion that was purportedly all about protecting women and girls and how special and precious they are.
Hey,
And with
Greta.
that, like,
Well, I mean, they
yes.
do have, like, in the majority, they do have a woman who also has daughters. It was notable to
Yes.
me that they were like, we got to give this to a man. Like, they didn't
Hmm.
even do what they do sometimes in Minnesota, where it's like, find a woman and have her do it. They were like, nah, it doesn't even matter.
Yeah. I don't think that you could have pried this opinion from Coach Kavanaugh's cold, dead hands.
His keg-filled hands.
Yeah. Honestly, I think he put both beers down to write this opinion, and that means something.
It's an important one for
Uh,
him. Yeah.
Mhm. And two of the big themes throughout the entire opinion were sports are different and girls are different. So
Mhm.
there was a lot of Justice Kavanaugh waxing poetic about the meaning of sports, how important sports are, that sports can be dangerous. Like he literally was explaining what spiking a volleyball is in the opinion. And he was also explaining a lot about how real biological differences exist between men and women and how they are enduring. And that word enduring is a quote he was pulling from a case called VMI, or Virginia Military Institute, or United States v. Virginia is the name of the actual opinion. And interestingly, in that opinion, Justice Ginsburg actually held that women could not be excluded from the Virginia Military Institute based on sex stereotypes. So it's just wild to be taking, something from that opinion and saying actually trans women and girls can be excluded based on the same types of sex stereotypes that case rejected.
Mhm.
In terms of the Title IX decision, I touched on this already, but the holding is that schools are allowed to maintain separate men's and women's sports teams based on sex and to use biological sex to define who is on what team. Justice Kavanaugh also took great pains to try and distinguish a previous Supreme Court case called Bostock, which was a decision under Title VII, finding that discriminating based on gender identity, sexual orientation would be impermissible under Title VII. So there was a lot of dancing around about how sports are just so different than employment to try and like make the math here. Spoiler alert, the math is not mathing.
Mhm.
And in terms of the equal protection ruling, it's a very unfortunate ruling. For the non-lawyers here, essentially, when you're reviewing a law for constitutional scrutiny, there are three options. Most laws, if they don't categorize people based on an impermissive characteristic, just get rational basis, and it's basically a rubber stamp. So if Minnesota said, no more peach yogurt, that would probably get rational basis review as long as the legislature had some minimal explanation, maybe protecting our local apple growers, that law, would pass. There's also intermediate scrutiny, and then there's strict scrutiny, which is the hardest thing to pass. And what the court found here is that the laws do discriminate based on sex, and they therefore are subjected to intermediate scrutiny. What that means is the state has to have an important interest that the law protects, and there has to be a strong connection or a substantial relationship between that state interest and what the law actually does, the purported purpose of the law. And they found that is met here. The state interest is in protecting women and girls' safety and the competitive fairness of women's and girls' teams. And the court found that there is a substantial connection because of the biological differences between men and women. And that's where there was just, the opinion was rank with sex stereotyping, essentially saying, well, men and boys, they are taller, they are stronger, they jump higher. And he kept using jumping ability, which like stood out as like, maybe Justice Kavanaugh isn't that good at sports because that's a really weird way to talk about jumping ability. Um, and interestingly
Everybody knows
here,
that in baseball, your jumping ability is actually the most important factor of whether you're good at baseball or not, is your jumping
yeah,
ability. Yeah, because all
and
sports are the
I'm
same.
I'm famously bad at sports, and even I know that's called your vertical. So get with it, Justice Kavanaugh, and like learn two things about sports before you tell me how badly getting hit with a volleyball is. I was like, clearly someone was bullied in gym class. He knows how much it hurts to get the volleyball spiked at him. Um, but what's interesting here is Justice Kavanaugh also denied that there was a need under the Constitution to conduct individual inquiries or inquiries about subclasses of people where that rationale that is offered just doesn't fit or doesn't make any sense. So here, the subclass that was brought was essentially, and this was B.P.J's case. So B.P.J was bringing a lawsuit on behalf of a subclass of transgender women and girls who did not have a competitive advantage because of the gender affirming care that they had received. So BPJ actually never went through male puberty. She started puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And by the time she was ready to compete on a high school level team, she had never undergone male puberty. So that substantial relationship about protecting women and girls is totally inapplicable to her. And likewise, all of Justice Kavanaugh's talk of how sports are zero sum, that someone has to lose for someone to win, was also inapplicable because BPJ's team didn't make cuts. So the rationales behind the law were totally inapplicable. But what the court said is essentially, as long as the fit is good enough, it's a substantial connection, it doesn't have to be perfect. And because the subclass was small enough, it would be okay to categorically exclude them, and just too hard to conduct an individualized inquiry to see if it would violate BPJ's rights or her subclass's rights. So essentially, this ban then can be applied where that rationale doesn't make any sense. And to things like, imagine a bowling team or a chess team
Mhm.
where biological differences might have absolutely no import on competitive advantage.
Well, I mean, I think part of the decision too, and I just want to be really clear about it, is that what the far right got here was a substitution of religion, a very narrow interpretation of some religions, instead of science, right? And it is like a really giant step forward to put into statute and then into case law that women are weak, and need protecting, right? And there's not too long of a jump after that saying, well, like, it's not actually that women and men don't have equal rights if women can't vote. Women actually don't have the capability to understand what it is that they're doing. So they have inherent differences, and that's why women can't vote. I mean, that's like really, truly like a huge step in the right direction for them to get into law that men and women have these enduring differences. And that these enduring differences means we get to be treated very differently when it comes to our rights. And that was what this decision read to me, is like, wow, they got everything that they could have ever wanted to achieve many, many more goals, other than targeting trans people. Chris, I do want to come to you and just talk a little bit about, in these decisions, what are you seeing? What were you hearing? And I do want to talk a little bit about like the effect of this, because you've brought up club sports, Greta brought up, chess, but there's esports mentioned. Like, talk a little bit about like the implication of this more broadly.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, earlier, the Idaho and West Virginia's laws both mention, they explicitly ban intramural and club sports in addition to the interscholastic and intercollegiate athletics. And Boise State, as I just found out today, is a prominent club for esports. They are six-time national champions for esports. And this one is really interesting to me because it goes along the lines of chess, of bowling, of fly fishing, of darts. Like these are sports that have banned trans women at the adult level. And it's interesting because you think like, okay, what do they think is the competitive advantage of esports? Like, is it like bigger thumbs? Like is that helpful? I don't know. And so this actually extends to is outrageous. Like at Boise State alone, this means that a trans woman could not play your classic intramural sports like volleyball or basketball, softball, soccer, but also means that she couldn't play the club sports like pickleball, like spike ball, which is like the trampoline thing you play on the beach. This one, cornhole, is a club sport. That is the beanbag barbecue game, right? And a trans woman would not be able to be on a women's cornhole team in club sports. Bowling is one, dodgeball is another. There are things like bouldering, which is rock climbing without the harness, broomball, which I think is the transphobic Harry Potter game renamed, and table tennis. Like we're talking ping pong, chess.
Yeah.
These are club sports that trans women and girls are not able to access. And these are, like very common after school things that we
Right.
do, particularly for your like non-stereotypically athletic people. We already know that trans people play sports at a far lower percentage than our cisgender peers and our LGBTQ peers. And there's reasons for that. Obviously, sports has become an incredibly hostile place, but 12% of trans girls and 14% of trans boys and 14% of non-binary kids in the country are estimated to play sports. And so, you think if somebody is not good at jumping ability, I did not know that this was going to be such a humorous like context. So thank you for keeping it lighthearted for me as my heart continues to break with every interview that I'm doing. I think when we're thinking about it, if a kid is not good at jumping, they might be good at chess. They might want to just connect with their peers over cornhole, and now they don't have the opportunity to do that.
And playing sports, being on a team is it's like a foundational experience to being an American kid, right? Like it is how we make friends, it's how we learn teamwork or how to follow directions, it's how we get outside or get in a group. And I think really ultimately, like there's many goals to this anti-trans campaign that's being run, but one of them is to deny these kids the like foundational experience of being part of a team and like playing with their friends, right? It's saying like you don't
Mhm.
get that. Not only the benefits, but like you don't get to be part of what really truly makes most American childhoods an American childhood.
Yeah, and sports is absolutely a part of our educational system, right? We
Yeah.
have phys ed classes, we have which are, our sports teams are going away, our gym classes are going away, unfortunately, because our educational system needs work. But it is baked into you have this is why B.P.J. was running in middle school, right? Like this is part of the way that kids learn. It is part of our school system. And so it's a really important that we have that access to that, but it's not only that we're taking away the access to it, it's also what the framing that Kavanaugh used in the writing in saying consistently biological male who identifies as a woman, biological boy who identifies as a girl. That language is so incredibly toxic. It's so hurtful and harmful. And that contributes to the rhetoric because it actually exposes what they're trying to do. They're trying to invalidate trans people's identities. And so by saying, B.P.J., you're not a girl, you cannot be on a girls' team, what they're doing is telling her peers, telling the school, telling the community that they should be looking at her differently. And so that absolutely has an impact outside of sports, outside of her doing shot put and discus, into the classroom, into her community.
And I just wanted to add a little bit to that to build on what you're both saying. And also, I should say, humor is my coping mechanism. I'm glad that you're able to laugh with us, Chris, but I certainly want to make sure I say that it's not to make light at all of how serious this decision is and the consequences. But if I can't laugh, I'm going to roll over and cry, which I have already. But uh, it's important too to think about the fact that Title IX isn't limited to sports. So
Right.
Title IX is all federally funded education programs. So while Brett Kavanaugh was using language about sports and how sports are distinct, there's no reason to think that that same type of logic about Title IX wouldn't be extended to other parts of educational programs. So imagine housing at a university and saying that, based on the biological differences between men and women, you can sex segregate housing and define sex based on biology. And then trans women aren't able to go to a college at all or to live at a college and have that part of their experience. Same for public facilities in these universities. So there's a lot of room for backsliding on ways that Title IX has been interpreted in positive ways, if those questions reach the Supreme Court. And this is essentially open invitation for those kinds of questions to reach the Supreme Court. And Erin touched on this as well. I think it is enough that this is open discrimination against trans people and trans women, but it's also such a fallacy to say that it's only trans people, that when you erode protections for trans women, you erode protections for all women. That these uh, blanket sex stereotypes about how cis women are weak and powerless and need to still be protected by Justice Kavanaugh, those justifications can reach into laws of all sorts. And there's no reason to think that this would be cabined just to sports or just to trans women and girls. We're in trouble when we rely on biology and fake science to segregate and discriminate.
And I also
Yeah,
think it's
if I could just oh,
yes.
sorry, if I could just expand on that, because what you just said is so important, that this will transfer over into other areas potentially, but also it begs the question of what is the mechanism for determination here, right? And so we've already seen this be implemented in sports policies in our K through 12 system, but also right now specifically in the Olympic level. And I'm going to keep adults out of this, but uh, how do you determine who then is a girl? There needs to be some sort of mechanism to check. And so some states have done birth certificates. And then when they realized that trans people can potentially change their birth certificate, they did birth certificate at or near the time of birth, right? Very specific. But there's also states that are asking for chromosomes testing, for genital inspection, internal and external genitals inspection to determine if your child is girl enough to play on the girls' teams. So, Greta, when you say that this impacts cisgender women and girls, it's going to mostly impact cisgender women and girls when we come to like the quantity of people who will be impacted. In terms of the devastation and impact, it's going to be impacting trans and intersex, women and girls specifically. But every single woman and girl then has to either prove her womanhood and her girlhood to potentially play or undergo some sort of investigation when called into question if they don't have a mechanism on the front end. And so it's a really dangerous situation that is being set up here for, and if it happens in sports, then it could happen in our shelter system, in our housing system, in other places and spaces in our world, even down to like, say, your workplace restroom. Are you woman enough to use the women's bathroom? It's a really dangerous, slippery slope that we've now crossed.
I have a 4-year-old daughter, and the idea of at 6 years old having to like have some sort of exam to prove she's a girl to play on the t-ball team, like absolutely not, right? And I think, there was a teachers group that filed a brief in one of our cases, and they talked about one of our clients had played on he had swam on a swim team, and they had talked about how you can't treat a kid equally and not discriminate them while they're in school, and then they leave school and walk on the field and discriminate against them, right? Like that actually isn't a thing you can do. And so we will see, I mean, Title IX protects you from discrimination on the basis of sex in education, right? And so if we are saying, yes, you can discriminate against trans people in this part in education, what is to stop it from being the rest of education? And, Title IX is often the way that we protect trans kids from other types of discrimination in the school building, right? Whether it's bullying or sexual harassment, that's true for all students. And so I think about what kind of world we're setting up for someone like my daughter, where it's like, actually, because you're a girl, somebody has to look in your pants so you can prove to them you're a girl so you can go play with your friends, right? Like, what kind of power and control and to whom are we handing this over to? And what does that say to our kids, any of our kids, that when a parent raises a question because you're really good or because you are black and you decided to like cut your hair to look like Olivia Miles or Courtney Williams and they don't believe that you're a girl, right? Like it's so easy to see the effect, and it will harm all kids. And somebody put into one of the question answers that in Alberta, they've had produce you have to like confirm that you're female, and they've seen a huge drop in girls participating in sports. And I will note that Minnesota, which has very inclusive policies and has had for almost 15 years, we have some of the highest participation rates in girls' sports in the state or in the country, in part because of our inclusive policies. So the cost of being inclusive is more participation, right? Like that is amazing to have here in Minnesota, and it's hard to watch this be rolled back.
Yeah, let me
It,
underscore that for you because in the states that have had inclusive policies over the past several years and even decades, like you've said, those states do have higher participation rates of cisgender girls in sports than states with bans. And it's for that exact reason. When we say that this is to protect women and girls and protect them from playing sports, apparently, because again, what girl is going to want to have to get a pelvic examination in order to play volleyball with her friends as a freshman in high school? It's not going to happen. So those inclusive policies open the door not only to the few trans kids in the state who want to play, and I say few because B.P.J was the only trans kid asking to play sports in West Virginia, the
yeah.
only one. And so we know that in many of the laws that have been passed to ban trans girls from sports, lawmakers can't even name one, or if
Right.
they can name a few, it is a handful, like literally less than five. And so again, it doesn't matter if it's just a few kids. To me, it wouldn't matter if it's 5 or 500 or 500,000 trans kids that wanted to compete in sports. They should be able to, right? And we shouldn't put them or any other kid in harm's way by having them have to undergo these examinations.
Yeah. And I will
Yeah.
note too, because, oh, go ahead, Greta.
Well, I was just going to say, like, Chris really hits the nail on the head that Justice Kavanaugh's justification is just undermined at every turn. That he says that it would be inadministrable, that it's too much of a burden to bring as applied challenges for someone like B.P.J., where she's the only trans kid who was trying to participate. That's not inadministrable. She already did it. She was most of the way, or a chunk of the way through her lawsuit and willing, to prove that it would be a violation of her rights to exclude her. And what is inadministrable is what Chris is describing, which is this regime of sex testing for everyone to try and root out trans people. That, that's what's inadministrable. And same for protecting women and girls, that if you're going to put something into effect, with chromosome testing, sex testing, spending all of this money, guess what's going to shut down? Women's and girls sports programs. Who's going to pay for that? That, it's at every turn, putting these bans into effect actually harms women and girls and gives them less opportunities to play.
And I,
And think about the amount of money that has gone into this fight, right? If we
yeah.
think about the amount of money, just even in campaign ads targeting transgender athletes in our last election cycle, topped over $220 million of funds. How, if you were really serious about protecting and uplifting women and girls sports, think about the impact that $200 million could have in creating better sporting spaces for our girls, for all girls, right? Again, like it just is mind blowing that this is the arguments that we're hearing when they do contradict themselves. Like this webinar writes itself.
Yeah, it really does. And, obviously Brett Kavanaugh didn't have like a ton of time spent with his children because nobody would put their child through a blood test, like put them next to a needle willingly. Like I would rather I would rather slide down a banister of razor blades into a pool of alcohol than try to give my 4-year-old like a shot or have her blood drawn from her. That would be, it's every parent's nightmare. Well, let's talk about, let's And then I want to remind folks on the Zoom, by the way, you can put stuff in the Q&A if you have questions. And thank you to Stacy for putting a little bit of information in there as well. Let's talk about where we go next, right? And so, Greta, I'm going to come to you first because for like the downer, because there is a separate federal lawsuit that's challenging Minnesota's inclusive policies that they violate Title IX, and that could be, a decision in that case could actually have an impact on our policies. Can you talk about what that case is and where it's at and what we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, there are actually three different cases to talk about here. The first two are um, related. It's Minnesota sued Trump over the executive orders, and then Trump sued Minnesota over our inclusive policies. So those are two closely related cases. And they're both in federal court right now, and they're at the very early stages. But it is essentially getting at that question that the Supreme Court said that they're not deciding, and that would be whether Title IX requires schools to segregate based on biological sex, or from an equal protection perspective, whether it would violate cisgendered girls' rights to have trans women and girls be allowed to participate on their teams. Those are essentially what I would call SCOTUS bait. I think that the rights plan is for those to reach the Supreme Court. And there's also a case called FAU, it's Female Athletes United, that's ongoing right now, and that's a group of cisgendered softball players, cisgendered girl softball players who are bringing a Title IX case that saying that allowing trans women and girls to participate on their teams would violate their rights or is actually discriminating against them. That's also in the very early stages. Before this decision came down, the Eighth Circuit, which is our middle court, our court of appeals for federal cases in Minnesota and a chunk of the Midwest, actually found against the Female Athletes United on the basis that there isn't intentional discrimination or an intent to discriminate based on the policy. We'll see if they change their tune now that the Supreme Court has sort of given them the open invitation to discriminate against trans women and girls. So, I don't want to be bleak, but these are some tough issues, and we should be concerned about where these cases are going and what's going to happen next.
I will say that the Eighth Circuit previously did rule in favor of a cisgender boy who wanted to participate on the dance team that had only been open to girls. It was in Minnesota, and the court found in favor of the boy, saying, well, there isn't a boys' dance team. You can't discriminate against this boy. And so we do have multiple court precedents saying, like, look, equal opportunity means equal opportunity. And if he doesn't have a dance team to dance on, then he gets. And so, like, they basically said, like, you can have sex segregated sports and you can't violate Title IX. So it was, we have that. Like, it's not just terrible things. I mean, that's my like little hope of there. Greta's like, no, Erin, you're not a lawyer. You don't know. Chris, I want to come to you and talk about how do we move forward as a community? What are we doing next? Like, where do we go? Where are you going with this, and where should we be turning our attention to?
Yeah, I think I was, really happy to see the outpour of support yesterday and today from our allies. Right now we have rallies happening. So I was at one in New York City last night. I think people did a lot of rapid response to rally the community to tell trans kids that they matter, that they belong. And so we're doing that. There's a series of field events. So these community joy, we want to keep the joy. It is a very tough time to be trans in America right now. And to be a trans kid with all of this going on, we can only imagine the fear and sort of chaos that they're experiencing. Because again, it's tough to be a kid. It's tough to be a kid with social media, and then to
Yeah.
be a kid who's constantly being talked about is probably something I can't even imagine. We are working right now to build stronger coalitions between our movements. And I think this is something that gender justice does so brilliantly is we're talking about sports, but also we're talking about bodily autonomy. We're all of these things are related with, and they're related to power and control. People, the government specifically, having power and control over how we live, who we are, right? How we show up in the world and how we experience our lives. And so when we can get our different groups together, our reproductive rights movement with our trans supportive group, right? Like our allies fighting for trans people, not only in sports, but in all areas of life, our general larger LGBTQ movement. When we get disability rights advocates, because there's no liberation without access. And happy Disability Pride Month, everybody. We need to be joining all of this together, and especially racial justice movements, because so much of these policies, as you mentioned, Erin, with mentioning somebody cutting their hair, right? Black, brown, and indigenous women are targeted the most. And so there's this extra layer of racism that's on top of the transphobia, on top of the sexism, on top of the misogyny. And so we need to build a stronger coalition. And what I'm really excited about is that I think that we are doing that. The voices are becoming louder, the people are becoming enraged, right? And so we're working on that. But in terms of like actual policy and law, the again, I will say there is no national ban. We have not created any new bans with this decision. The states that had bans still have them. The states that allowed trans kids to play still allow them to play. And so we are working to stop additional states from implementing bans, but we are also fighting ballot initiatives, because this is the next iteration of creating anti-trans laws, is that when lawmakers have been unable to pass them through legislation, get them through committee, get the votes to pass these laws, they're trying different tactics. So now there are a group of states that are trying to put this on the ballot for the general public to vote on. And that's an incredibly dangerous situation for us, because again, the rhetoric that exists right now, the myths and misinformation that's out there about trans athletes is so pervasive. And it has gotten like, the truth is, if you repeat a lie a number of times, people will believe it to be true. And you could even have the person who created the lie, who said, say it was a lie, I made that up completely. And people will still choose to believe the lie because it has been repeated so much. We're seeing that with the election was stolen conversation as an example, but we were seeing this, explicitly with trans people existing in the world. If they try to paint us as a danger on the court of the field, they can say that we are a threat everywhere else.
Right.
And that is the underscore, the bottom line here. So we are going to fight those ballot initiatives, try to get them not on the ballot, but then if they do get on the ballot, have a large, hopefully nationwide campaign to correct this misinformation and really get voters to understand what's at stake here.
I think that's so important. And I'm going to put into the chat, you were talking about how racialized this is. And we have a case with a client who was in a Buffalo Wild Wings bathroom. And she's a biracial girl. And she was just using the bathroom, and a waitress followed her in and yelled at her, and she had to like open her shirt to prove she had breasts to get her to stop. Right. And so like this kind of harassment, this misinformation, it bleeds into every part of life. Right. And I think the message really is that kind of what we talked about earlier, right? Women are weak and they're powerless. The subtext, especially in abortion bans, are like, and they're stupid. And if the government doesn't tell them when they can't have abortions, they'll just have them whenever because they're so flighty and dumb, right? And all of that is laying the stage to be like, and now they are second-class citizens with fewer rights, but they're not fewer rights because they're not equal to men, right? Like that's the whole thing, is that like they have differences that are enduring, and so they just like have, separate but equal rights. And I think that is also, it starts with trans people, right? It starts with going to folks who don't gender conform the most. But after that is gender conformity for everybody else, right? It is, you don't look like a woman, you don't act like a woman, you're not married like a woman, you shouldn't do that. That is what gender conformity ultimately comes for. They're just starting with trans people. It's a very, very dangerous movement that's hateful and has been deadly. And we're still just in that beginning stage. And it's so hard sometimes to talk about the full picture. But that really is like the legal messaging goal, is to kind of create that legal status and justification for that status. I'm going to look in the Q&A. Well, there's a question about the Minnesota ERA and whether that would further protect the rights of trans people in Minnesota and of trans athletes to participate. Greta, can I come to you? Unless, Chris, you're very well versed in the Minnesota ERA for some reason. But Greta, I can come to you. Speaking of state ballot initiatives, this is a positive one.
Yes, absolutely. That's the bottom line. Need I say more? Yes, I will because I can't help myself. Policies can change a lot easier. It's, possible that Minnesota's policy, might change because the legislature decides to change it. Politics are fickle that way, but getting an ERA in the Constitution would be like a much stronger and more enduring protection. It might even endure longer than those biological differences between the sexes that Justice Kavanaugh relied upon so much. So, yes, an ERA is important. It's a good thing to support, and we will continue fighting for an ERA. You're muted.
I'm talking to myself. I was saying I'm doing tech and moderating, and I'm putting the link in the chat for the Minnesota Equal Rights Amendment so people can see that. Thank you for talking about that. Um, I want to like leave space if there's any other questions, but while people might type in the last ones, being mindful of time too for everybody, um, let's close out and just like leave with something that is like a final thought on a tough week. And Greta, I was going to come to you and maybe talk about what you did yesterday in North Dakota.
Yes, so yesterday I was with a team of lawyers from Gender Justice and the Lawyering Project, opposing North Dakota's ban on gender affirming care for transgender youth in the North Dakota Supreme Court. And our attorney, Tanya Pellegrini, put on a wonderful argument. She did a fantastic job. And I think what was really resonant with me was that the mother of one of the children who's been affected by that ban was there. It's one of our clients in that case. And she was there to make sure that she was seen and that, the justices had to look her in the eye if they were going to take away her rights and her child's rights to make healthcare decisions for themselves. So it went very well. And while North Dakota is a very tough jurisdiction, we're very proud of the case we put on, and that we're out there standing up for trans kids and saying that you're not alone and we'll take up this fight with you.
And one of my favorite moments from yesterday was the lawyer having a moment to talk about the trans woman who was present and like known by the framers of the North Dakota Constitution, right? And it just proves positive that trans people have always existed. There has never been a world where trans people don't exist. There was a trans woman who was actually Mrs. Nash. Thank you. There was a trans woman who was very instrumental in passing one of the amendments to the United States Constitution. She traveled all the way to Congress and testified in front of Congress. And so it was just this beautiful reminder of like, no, trans people have always been here. What's new is what y'all are doing. Stop it. And so it was always good to stand up for trans kids, whether it's North Dakota or Minnesota. Chris, I want to come to you for a final thought. If you want to leave us with some hope and inspiration to keep fighting, maybe ways that you're fighting. And I'm sorry to put that all on you, right? It's like be a trans athlete and give us hope, Chris. But you're also a gender justice board member, so you're kind of my boss. So, look to you.
Wow, I've never thought of it that way. Okay, while I do that, Erin, I noticed that you had put the stuff in the chat only to host and panelists. So can you repost the links that you were posting and give it to everybody who's in attendance while I'm chatting? That'd be amazing.
Thank you.
I got you. As your boss, I've got you. Okay. Here's what I'm going to leave you with, folks. So, I mentioned that I was really, really happy to see the overwhelming outpouring of support yesterday, all of the affirming messages online. It's just a reminder that so many people care about us and support us. But what I'm going to leave you with for hope actually is from Becky's mom. And I can already tell I'm going to cry, and it's okay because it's amazing. All right. So I was texting with Becky's mom, Heather, yesterday, and I was checking in after the decision. How's everybody holding up? And she wrote back and said, I'm just going to read this here. She said, when I told her the decision, I also made sure that she knows that states that say that trans kids can participate, for now, Trump can't touch because of everything that she did. And she said, I love that. And she said, I did good then. And like, that's the part I think that gets me. It's just like, I can hear her saying it. She's a kid, right? She's like, I did good then. She sees it as a victory for other kids, and that's making her happy, right? And Heather goes on and said that she's really happy because all of these conversations, all of Becky's fight actually caused West Virginia to make a policy not to allow protests on the podium. And Heather said it's the little wins, right? She cares so much about the other trans kids because she's lived that hate from others. Through it all, I see her joy in finding her niche in society. She is determined to help trans youth through her life and through her career. She's definitely not losing her desire to fight against the oppression of this current political environment. So that's the message that I got from Heather, and I just want to share in the chat right now to everyone, no shade. Heather's op-ed in USA Today. It came out yesterday. It is just a beautiful piece of writing and parenting. It is model. So when I'm looking at these texts and hearing from Heather about Becky's perspective on this, I'm thinking like, if a 15-year-old kid who's been fighting this fight in public for the last 5 years can have hope in her heart, then we can too. Like, and we all should, right? Because every kid matters. Every single one of us should keep hope in our hearts and fight like hell to make sure that these kids know it. Because our commitment to fighting for our trans youth builds off of the incredible energy and fighting spirit of Minnesotans who banded together not long ago and still, right, to keep their neighbors safe under ICE occupation. And this builds off the energy of what Greta just talked about in North Dakota, rallying for trans youth and their rights to access the healthcare they deserve. So as our outrage grows, so too does our power. And so let's all look to Becky not only as an example of who we are standing up for, but also let's look to Becky, her optimism and her hope and her fighting spirit as an example of what we are all called to do in this moment together.
That's beautiful. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to end with this gratitude for Becky Pepper Jackson because of her, the decision didn't touch Minnesota yesterday. And also because of Representative Karen Clark, who died yesterday at 80, who put in protections for trans people to the Minnesota Human Rights Act in 1993. So we are bookended by a trailblazer and a life-changing legislator and a 15-year-old girl is why in Minnesota today we can say that trans kids can still participate and while we are still fighting for kids in North Dakota. Thank you all so much for joining this evening. It is a pleasure to be in community with you at all times. Greta, you are incredible. Chris, you are incredible. Thank you so much. And we will see you next time, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. And Erin, you're incredible too.
Very, very.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.